The hardest kind of silence isn't the one that fills an empty room. It's the silence that settles inside a mother's heart after years of waiting for footsteps that never come. Soft sigh. Eleanor was 76 years old when she finally admitted something she had spent decades refusing to believe. Love could survive almost anything: poverty, exhaustion, heartbreak, but it could still be left standing alone. If you had met her that winter morning, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. She moved carefully through the little house she had lived in for most of her life, pausing every few steps as aching knees reminded her that time never bargains with anyone. Her silver hair framed a face softened by age, yet her eyes still carried the warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime putting everyone else before herself. Every corner of that house held a memory. The worn wooden table had once been crowded with noisy dinners. The faded curtains had hidden children playing games they thought their parents couldn't see. Even the old hallway seemed to remember laughter that had long since disappeared. Those memories were all that remained of the family Eleanor and her husband, Thomas, had dreamed of building together. Years earlier, they hadn't known much. Thomas worked long shifts in a factory, returning home with tired hands and a smile that somehow made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. Eleanor filled their tiny home with warmth instead of wealth. She believed children didn't remember expensive gifts nearly as much as bedtime songs, homemade meals, and parents who never stopped believing in them. Together they welcomed 3 children into the world. James arrived first, quiet and curious. Michael followed, bursting with enough energy to keep the whole neighborhood awake. Then came little Lily, whose tiny fingers wrapped around Eleanor's thumb as though she already knew where safety lived. Those were the happiest years of Eleanor's life. She truly believed they would last forever. But forever ended on an ordinary afternoon. Thomas left for work with a smile and a promise that he'd be home before dinner. He never came back. A sudden heart attack stole him away before anyone had the chance to say goodbye. Long pause. That evening, Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen after putting 3 frightened children to bed. She cried as quietly as she could because she didn't want them to hear the sound of their mother's heart breaking. By sunrise, the tears were gone. Bills still had to be paid. Hungry children still needed breakfast. And 3 young lives were depending on one exhausted woman who had no idea how she was supposed to carry an entire family by herself. She took one deep breath and made a promise that would quietly shape every remaining year of her life. The next morning, Eleanor's alarm rang long before the sun had even thought about rising. There was no one beside her anymore. No familiar voice wishing her luck. No comforting hand reminding her they would get through this together. Only silence. Deep breath. She wrapped herself in an old coat, kissed each sleeping child on the forehead, and stepped into the cold darkness while the village still slept. Her first job began before dawn, cleaning classrooms at the local school. Empty desks stretched across quiet rooms, waiting for children who would never know the woman polishing their floors was fighting every day to keep her own children in school. By the time the first bell rang, Eleanor's back already ached. Her hands were rough from scrubbing, and the smell of cleaning solution clung to her clothes. But her day was far from over. She hurried home, prepared breakfast, packed lunches, checked homework, tied shoelaces, wiped away tears over forgotten assignments, and somehow managed to smile through every rushed morning. The children never realized how carefully she hid her exhaustion. Whenever James apologized for needing another textbook, she smiled. "We'll find a way." When Michael worried about the cost of repairing his old bicycle so he could get to school, she laughed gently. "Leave that to me." When Lily quietly admired a dress in a shop window but insisted she didn't really want it, Eleanor squeezed her hand. "One day, my sweetheart." That one day became the answer to almost everything. She stopped buying new clothes for herself. The same winter coat lasted year after year. Shoes were repaired instead of replaced. If there was only enough food for 3 full plates, Eleanor claimed she had already eaten while cooking. The children believed her. A mother's greatest performance is often the one her children never notice. At night, after everyone was asleep, Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table with stacks of unpaid bills spread before her. She counted every coin. Some nights, The numbers simply refused to work. She would close her eyes, whisper Thomas's name, and ask for strength instead of miracles. Because miracles felt too expensive. Years passed, one sacrifice at a time. James developed a passion for medicine after watching a village doctor comfort frightened patients. Michael could take apart almost anything mechanical before he reached his teenage years. Lily discovered that nothing made her happier than helping younger children learn to read. Eleanor watched each dream grow with quiet pride. She never told them how many opportunities she had quietly given up so theirs could survive. As graduation season finally arrived, she sat in the very last row of every ceremony, wearing the same carefully mended dress she had owned for years. Her applause was louder than anyone else's. Her tears flowed freely. One by one, her children crossed the stage, holding diplomas that represented far more than academic success. They represented every early morning, every skipped meal, every sleepless night. When the ceremonies ended, all three wrapped their arms around her. "We couldn't have done this without you, Mama." Eleanor closed her eyes, believing those words would remain true forever. She had no way of knowing that life was already preparing a different future, one where gratitude would slowly fade, distance would quietly grow, and the woman who gave everything would one day find herself waiting beside a window that no one seemed to remember. Years slipped by almost unnoticed. The little house that had once echoed with running feet became quieter with each passing season. Suitcases were packed. Dreams grew larger than the village could hold. One after another, Eleanor's children stepped into new chapters of their lives. She couldn't have been prouder. James earned his place as a respected doctor, helping people through some of the hardest days of their lives. Michael transformed his love for fixing engines into a successful business. Lily became the teacher she had always dreamed of being, welcoming children into her classroom with the same kindness Eleanor had shown her. Whenever neighbors congratulated Eleanor, she smiled with shining eyes. "They worked hard," she would say, but in her heart, she quietly added, they were worth every sacrifice. The city offered opportunities the village never could. Better jobs, better schools, bigger homes. So they left. Eleanor stood at her front gate, waving until each car disappeared beyond the bend in the road. She refused to let them see the tears gathering in her eyes. "Go build beautiful lives," she whispered after they were gone. "Don't worry about me." At first, they didn't. Almost every weekend, someone came home. The house came alive again. Grandchildren chased one another across the garden, their laughter floating through the warm afternoon air. Eleanor filled the kitchen with the rich aroma of home-cooked meals, preparing everyone's favorite dishes without ever asking what they wanted. Somehow, she always remembered. The dining table was crowded once more. Stories overlapped. Laughter spilled from room to room. Family photographs captured smiling faces beneath the old mango tree, where little hands reached for fruit while grandparents pretended not to notice. Those weekends became Eleanor's greatest treasure. She counted the days between visits, marking each date carefully on a calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Then, almost too slowly to notice, things began to change. One visit was canceled because of an important meeting. Another because one of the grandchildren had a school competition. The next because traffic would be too difficult. Every reason sounded reasonable. Every apology sounded sincere. "Mama, we'll definitely come next weekend. I promise." Eleanor believed every promise. She folded away the extra blankets she had prepared for her grandchildren. She wrapped leftovers for neighbors after meals that no one arrived to eat. Still, she never complained. Whenever friends asked if she felt lonely, she answered with the same gentle smile. "They're building their futures. That's exactly what their father and I wanted." But late at night, after washing dishes that had barely been used, she would pause beside the family photographs lining the living room wall. Her fingers rested lightly on each smiling face. "So busy now," she whispered. The phone still rang.
Just not for very long.
"Hi, Mama. Everything okay?" "Yes, my dear. We're rushing to another appointment. We'll talk properly soon." "I understand." The calls ended almost as quickly as they began. Yet Eleanor never mentioned how eagerly she had waited to hear those familiar voices. One autumn evening, she turned another page on the calendar. 3 months had passed since anyone had come home. She looked toward the empty driveway, telling herself they were simply caught up with life. Then she glanced at December circled in red. Christmas. This year, she said softly, a hopeful smile returning to her face. This year we'll all be together again. She had no idea that the holiday she was already planning would become the longest, quietest day of her entire life. Winter slowly gave way to spring, but the heaviness inside Eleanor's heart remained. The Christmas table had long been cleared away, yet she still couldn't bring herself to use all 6 chairs. Most days, she ate at one corner of the table, leaving the others untouched, as though they still belonged to the family she kept believing would return. Life settled into a quiet routine. She watered the flowers Thomas had planted years ago. She swept the front porch every morning. She waved to neighbors passing by, always wearing the same gentle smile that hid far more than anyone could see. When the phone rang, her heart still skipped. Sometimes it was James calling between patients. "Mama, just checking in. Everything all right?" "I'm doing well, sweetheart. I'm glad. I have to run. We'll talk soon." The line would go silent before she could ask how he was really doing. Michael usually called while driving. "Business has been crazy, Mama. I'm happy things are going well. I'll visit when everything settles down." Everything never seemed to settle down. Lily called the most often, but even those conversations felt hurried. "The children have so much homework. I understand. I miss you." "I miss you too, dear." Those 3 words lingered long after every call ended. Then, one rainy afternoon, everything changed. Eleanor was carrying a kettle of hot tea across the kitchen when her foot caught the edge of a worn rug. The world tilted. She reached for the counter.
Missed.
The cup shattered against the floor. A sharp pain shot through her arm as she landed hard on the cold tiles. For several long moments, she couldn't move. Only the ticking clock answered her frightened breaths. "Help!" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Harper, who noticed the front door standing open and came inside. She found Eleanor trembling on the floor. "Oh, Eleanor." Within minutes, an ambulance carried her to the hospital. The doctor examined the broken arm before speaking gently. "We'll take good care of you, but someone from your family should know." Mrs. Harper looked toward Eleanor. "Which child should I call?" Eleanor hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the window. "They're very busy." The words hurt more than the fracture. Eventually, all 3 children were informed. By evening, Lily arrived first. She hugged her mother tightly, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm so sorry this happened." Eleanor smiled weakly. "I'm all right now." A day later, James and Michael joined them. For a brief moment, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Perhaps this accident had reminded them that family still mattered. Perhaps things would finally be different. The 4 of them sat together in the hospital room.
No one spoke for a while.
Then James cleared his throat. "We've been talking." Michael lowered his eyes. Lily reached gently for her mother's hand. "Mama, we think it's time to consider somewhere safer." Eleanor listened quietly. "A place with nurses," Lily continued softly. "People who can help you every day." James nodded. "You wouldn't be alone if something happened again." Michael forced a smile. "And we'd be able to visit much more often." Those words echoed through the room. Visit much more often. Eleanor searched each familiar face. Not one of them seemed cruel. Not one seemed angry. They honestly believed they were making the right decision. That realization somehow hurt the most. She looked down at the wedding ring she still wore on a thin chain around her neck. Thomas had trusted her to keep their family together. Now she wondered if letting go of the home they had built together was the final promise she would have to break. She closed her eyes. Then, with a calmness that surprised even herself, she whispered 4 words that shattered what remained of her heart. "If that's best, okay." She didn't realize that the hardest goodbye was still waiting for her. A week after leaving the hospital, Eleanor returned to the little house that had sheltered her for nearly half a century. The cast on her arm made every movement slow, but it wasn't the injury that weighed on her most. It was knowing she had come home to say goodbye. The decision had already been made. Her children had found a nursing home they believed would keep her safe. They spoke about caring staff, emergency assistance, and comfortable rooms. Everything they said made sense. Yet the heart rarely listens to reason. Long pause. Eleanor stood in the hallway for several minutes before taking a single step forward. Every room seemed to greet her. The living room still held the faded sofa where Thomas had fallen asleep after long days at the factory, the newspaper slipping from his hands while the children climbed over him, laughing. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon, though she hadn't baked in weeks. She could almost hear tiny voices arguing over who would stir the cake batter or sneak an extra cookie before dinner. She smiled through tears. You were all so little. She wandered into each bedroom. James's old bookshelf still leaned slightly to one side because he had insisted on fixing it himself as a boy. Michael's bedroom closet still had pencil marks inside the doorframe, measuring how much taller he had grown every birthday. Lily's room held a small music box on the windowsill. Eleanor wound it gently. A delicate melody filled the room. For a moment, she could almost see her little girl twirling barefoot across the floor, giggling as her dress spun around her. Then the music stopped. So did the memory. Outside, the garden waited beneath the afternoon sun. The roses Thomas had planted were still blooming. The mango tree stretched proudly over the yard, its branches wide enough to shade generations of family photographs. Eleanor rested her hand against its rough trunk. We grew old together, she whispered. One by one, she packed the few things that mattered most. A worn photo album with cracked corners. Thomas's wedding ring, carefully wrapped in a handkerchief. 3 crayon drawings made by tiny hands decades earlier, each one proudly signed with uneven letters. She left behind furniture, curtains, dishes. None of those carried the pieces of her heart. When her children arrived that afternoon, they worked quickly, loading the small suitcase into the car. It's a nice place, Mama, Michael said gently. You'll like the staff, James added. Lily slipped her arm around Eleanor's shoulders. We'll visit often. Eleanor smiled. I know.
She didn't ask when.
Before climbing into the car, she turned back toward the house one last time. The windows reflected the golden light of late afternoon. For an instant, she imagined Thomas standing at the front door, smiling as he always had after work. She raised her hand in a tiny wave. Then she reached for the old brass key. The lock clicked softly. Such an ordinary sound. Yet it echoed like the closing of an entire lifetime. As the car disappeared down the road, Eleanor kept looking through the rear window until the house became nothing more than a distant shape, and finally vanished completely. She had no idea that behind the doors of the nursing home, where she expected only loneliness, someone was about to walk into her life and remind her that family is not always connected by blood. The nursing home looked nothing like Eleanor's house. Its walls were freshly painted, the floors polished until they reflected the ceiling lights, and the air carried the sharp scent of disinfectant instead of warm bread and blooming flowers. Everything was clean. Everything was organized. And somehow, nothing felt like home. Soft sigh. A staff member showed Eleanor to her room. It was small but comfortable. A single bed stood beside a window overlooking a quiet courtyard. A wooden chair rested in one corner, and a modest wardrobe waited for clothes she no longer cared much about. This will be your room, the woman said kindly. Eleanor thanked her with a gentle smile. After the door closed, the silence returned. She slowly unpacked her suitcase. The first thing she placed on the bedside table was Thomas's wedding ring. Next came the family photo album. Then the 3 faded drawings her children had made decades ago. Looking at them made the room feel a little less unfamiliar. Still, every night was the same. She lay awake listening to distant footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes another resident called out in confusion. Sometimes a nurse hurried past her door. Sometimes she simply stared at the ceiling until morning arrived. More than once, she wondered if her children were thinking about her before they went to sleep, or if they had already grown used to the empty place she had left behind. Days blended together. Meals were served at the same time. Medicine arrived on schedule. Visitors came and went for other residents. Whenever footsteps paused outside her room, Eleanor instinctively looked toward the door. Usually, they continued down the hallway. She never complained. Loneliness had become something she wore quietly. Then, one afternoon, someone knocked gently. Not the hurried knock of a busy employee. A slow, respectful one. A young nurse stepped inside carrying a steaming cup of tea. She had warm brown eyes and a smile that reached them before her words did. "I thought you might like something warm," she said. Eleanor accepted the cup with both hands. "Thank you. My name is Amina." "I'm Eleanor." For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. As Amina adjusted a blanket folded at the end of the bed, her eyes noticed the old photographs resting on the table. She picked up one carefully. 3 smiling children surrounded a younger Eleanor beneath a large mango tree. "They have beautiful smiles," Amina said softly. "They're my children. They must love these memories." Eleanor looked at the photograph for a long moment before answering. "I hope they do." Amina sensed there was more behind those words, but she didn't ask. Instead, she placed the picture back exactly where she had found it. Before leaving, she smiled warmly. "If you don't mind, I'll bring your tea again tomorrow." "I'd like that." The next day, she returned. And the day after that. Sometimes they spoke for only a few minutes. Sometimes they sat quietly, watching birds outside the window. One rainy afternoon, Amina found Eleanor humming an old lullaby while gently tracing the edges of a faded photograph. "You used to sing that to someone," Amina said. "To all 3 of my children." Amina pulled the chair closer. "Would you tell me about them?" Eleanor hesitated. The memories had been locked inside her heart for so long. But something about this young woman's gentle voice made them feel safe. She took a slow breath. Then, for the first time since arriving at the nursing home, Eleanor began telling the story of her life. She had no idea that the person listening was about to change not only her days, but the way she understood love itself. The first words were the hardest. Eleanor looked down at the photograph in her hands, gently brushing away a speck of dust with her thumb. For a long moment, she wondered where to begin. How do you fit an entire lifetime of love into a single conversation? Deep breath. Amina didn't rush her. She simply sat beside the window, her hands folded in her lap, giving Eleanor the rare gift of being heard without interruption. Finally, Eleanor smiled faintly. "I wasn't always this old," she said with a quiet laugh. Amina laughed with her. "I had guessed that much." The little joke broke the heaviness between them. Then the memories began to flow. Eleanor spoke about Thomas, how he always whistled on his way home from work, even after the longest shifts. She described the tiny house they had filled with hope instead of money, the nights they stayed awake with sick children, and the dreams they whispered after everyone else had fallen asleep. She talked about the morning Thomas never came home, about learning to hide her tears so 3 frightened children would believe everything would somehow be all right. She spoke of the winters when she wore an old coat so her children could have warm ones. The birthdays she celebrated with homemade cakes because there wasn't enough money for presents. The nights she quietly skipped dinner, pretending she wasn't hungry. Amina listened without saying a word. Now and then, she reached for a tissue. Not for Eleanor, but for herself. The story wasn't just making her emotional. It was changing something inside her. When Eleanor finally paused, the room fell silent. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered. "I've talked far too much." Amina shook her head immediately.
No.
Her voice trembled. "You've reminded me of someone." She looked toward the window before continuing. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died. She sacrificed everything so I could finish school." She smiled through tears. "I became a nurse because she always believed caring for people was one of the greatest gifts we could give." Eleanor reached across the small space between them and gently squeezed Amina's hand. She raised a remarkable woman. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words were no longer necessary. From that day forward, something quietly changed. Amina still cared for every resident with kindness, but she always found a few extra minutes for Eleanor. She brought fresh tea, exactly the way Eleanor liked it. She borrowed library books and read aloud when Eleanor's eyes grew tired. Sometimes they completed crossword puzzles together. Sometimes they simply watched the rain slide down the windows without saying anything at all. Other residents began noticing. "You always leave that room smiling," one elderly man teased Amina. She smiled back. "Because she reminds me that love doesn't disappear. It just finds new places to live." Eleanor overheard those words. That evening, as she prepared for bed, she realized something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't counting the hours until someone called. She wasn't staring endlessly at the doorway. For the first time in a very long while, tomorrow was no longer something to endure. It was something to look forward to. And without realizing it, the lonely woman who believed she had nothing left to give was about to become the quiet source of comfort for everyone around her. Healing did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, in the smallest moments. A warm cup of tea waiting on her bedside table. A friendly wave from another resident across the hallway. A shared laugh over a forgotten crossword answer. Little by little, the heavy loneliness that had once followed Eleanor everywhere began to loosen its grip. Soft sigh. One afternoon, Amina found Eleanor sitting beside a gentleman named Mr. Harris, who had been unusually restless all morning. Instead of speaking, Eleanor simply held his hand. She hummed an old lullaby, the same one she had once sung to her children. The anxious lines on the man's face slowly softened. By the time the song ended, he had drifted peacefully to sleep. "You have a special gift," Amina whispered later. Eleanor smiled. "I only know what it feels like to be afraid." From then on, the staff often invited her to spend time with residents who were lonely or confused. She listened to their stories without judgment. She celebrated birthdays that others had forgotten. She sat beside those who cried at night because they could no longer remember the faces of the people they loved. When someone felt invisible, Eleanor made sure they were seen. Soon, the residents began looking for her every morning. "Good morning, Eleanor. Will you join us for tea? Tell us another story today." The once quiet woman who had entered the nursing home carrying only sorrow had become the gentle heart of the place. Even the newest residents seemed to relax after speaking with her. One evening, the home's director smiled as she watched Eleanor comforting a frightened newcomer. "You've given this place something we could never teach," she told Amina. "You've reminded everyone that kindness is just as important as medicine." Amina nodded proudly. "She reminds us every day. Yet some wounds healed more slowly than others." The phone still rang from time to time. On Eid, all three children called. Their voices were cheerful. "Mama, Eid Mubarak? Eid Mubarak, my dears. We've sent some money to your account. Thank you. We'll try to visit soon. I'll be happy whenever you can." The conversations ended after only a few minutes. No one asked what books she had been reading. No one knew about Mr. Harris or the birthday party she had helped organize for another resident. No one realized she had become the person everyone else turned to when they needed comfort. After each call, Eleanor sat quietly for a while. The ache was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She had stopped measuring love by the number of visits she received. Instead, she measured it by the kindness she was still able to give. That evening, Amina joined her in the courtyard as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" she asked gently. Eleanor thought for a long time before answering. "Of course." She smiled sadly. A mother never stops missing her children. Then she looked toward the sky glowing with the colors of sunset. "But if I spend every day grieving what I lost, I might miss the blessings still standing beside me." Amina reached over and wrapped her arm around Eleanor's shoulders. Neither of them noticed that someone had quietly witnessed the moment from the entrance of the nursing home. A familiar face stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by what they had just seen. The past had finally come knocking. And this time, it wasn't Eleanor who was waiting. The woman standing at the entrance couldn't move. It was Lily. She had come without calling, hoping to surprise her mother with a short visit before driving back to the city. Instead, She found herself watching from a distance as Eleanor sat beside Amina, smiling with a peace Lily hadn't seen in years. For a moment, she didn't recognize her own mother. Not because Eleanor had changed, but because Lily had forgotten what quiet strength looked like. Long pause. She had expected to find a lonely woman waiting by the window. Instead, she found someone comforting others. Someone who still gave love freely, even after carrying so much disappointment. Lily's eyes filled with tears. She suddenly remembered being 5 years old, waking from a nightmare and finding her mother sitting beside her bed before she even had time to cry out. She remembered scraped knees that were kissed better, school lunches that somehow always included her favorite treat, warm winter scarves wrapped around her neck before Eleanor left the house wearing an old, threadbare coat herself. Memories she hadn't thought about in years came rushing back all at once. How had she forgotten? She walked slowly across the courtyard. Eleanor. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Eleanor turned. For a second, surprise crossed her face. Then came the same gentle smile she had always worn whenever one of her children appeared. Lily. Lily fell into her mother's arms. "I'm so sorry." The words came between quiet sobs. "I kept telling myself I was busy. I thought there would always be more time. I didn't realize how many moments I was missing." Eleanor held her daughter the way she had held her as a child. Without anger. Without blame. Only love. A few minutes later, James and Michael arrived. Lily had called them from the parking lot, her voice trembling so much that neither brother asked questions. They simply came. The three of them stood before their mother in silence. James looked down. "I spend every day reminding families not to take life for granted."
His voice cracked.
"Somehow, I forgot my own." Michael wiped his eyes. "I kept promising I'd visit when work slowed down." He gave a broken smile. It never did. No one tried to defend themselves anymore.
There were no excuses left.
Only truth. Eleanor looked at each of them with a tenderness that had survived every unanswered phone call, every empty holiday, and every lonely night. "My dear children," she said softly, "life becomes busy for all of us." They listened without breathing. But never becomes so busy that the people who loved you first begin wondering if they still matter. Silence settled over the courtyard. Not an uncomfortable silence. A healing one. From that day forward, things were different. Not perfect. Different. The visits became real instead of postponed. Birthdays were celebrated together. Grandchildren filled Eleanor's room with laughter, asking her to tell the same stories again and again. James often stayed after everyone else had left, simply to share a cup of tea. Michael repaired the old garden bench outside the nursing home so they could sit together beneath the trees. Lily visited every weekend, sometimes bringing nothing more than homemade biscuits and a few unhurried hours. Amina watched it all with a quiet smile. One afternoon, Eleanor squeezed her hand. "You gave me something I thought I had lost." Amina smiled gently. "No, Amy. You kept it alive yourself." Years later, when people asked Eleanor what she had learned from her long life, she never spoke about disappointment first.
She spoke about love.
Because love doesn't always return in the way we expect. Sometimes it comes back through a stranger who becomes family. Sometimes it returns in children who finally understand what they almost lost. And sometimes the greatest act of love is choosing to keep your heart open, even after it has been broken. Soft sigh. My name is Eleanor. I have known joy. I have known loneliness. I have known forgiveness. If my journey leaves you with one lesson, let it be this. Call your parents. Visit your grandparents. Hold the hands that once held yours. One ordinary afternoon can become a memory you never get the chance to make again. And if you are the one waiting by the window, please don't stop living while you wait. Because your kindness, your courage, and your love still have the power to change someone's world.